The morning hit Linden Falls, Minnesota, at 6:14 a.m. on February 19th, 2025, but David Carver didn't notice the time. The cold came first, not the kind that woke you gently, but the sort that carved through your lungs and made you remember things you'd buried deep. The air smelled of iron and frozen earth, and his breath hung in pale ribbons that dissolved before reaching the pines lining Whitefish Pond. His German shepherd, Axel, a 5-year-old sable-coated male with amber eyes that held more patience than David had ever managed, tugged at the leash with steady insistence. The dog's ears stood erect, nostrils flaring as he processed a world David could only guess at through the scent molecules clinging to the frozen air. David's hands, scarred and rough from 2 tours in Kandahar, gripped the nylon lead tighter than necessary. He hadn't slept through the night in 4 years, and this morning was no different. The nightmares had woken him at 4:32 a.m., soaked in sweat, the phantom sound of an IED still ringing in his ears. So he'd done what he always did, pulled on his boots, clipped Axel's lead, and walked into the cold until the shaking stopped. Out here, the world made sense in a way the town never did. No crowds, no sudden noises, just the rhythm of his boots crunching through yesterday's snowfall and Axel's steady presence at his side. If you believe that sometimes the broken are the ones meant to save others, drop a comment with where you're watching from and hit subscribe. This is a story about trust, survival, and the miracles we don't see coming. Linden Falls sat 32 miles northeast of Duluth. Population 4,800, a town built on logging and ice fishing and the quiet understanding that winter would always test you harder than you thought you could bear. Whitefish Pond stretched 2 miles across at its widest point, fed by snowmelt from the Superior Highlands, and every winter the ice thickened to depths that the old-timers swore by and the young ones tested with four-wheelers. The pond lay at an elevation of 1,420 feet, surrounded by a mix of red pine and paper birch that whispered in the wind like old women gossiping over fences. The town's fire department and sheriff's office shared a building on Main Street, a brick structure with a faded sign that read Linden Falls Emergency Services since 1947, and inside, Deputy Chief Rachel Moss kept a whiteboard with ice thickness reports updated daily during the season. This morning it read, Whitefish Pond, 14 inches center, 9 inches near shore inlets, caution advised near aerators. The National Weather Service had issued a winter weather advisory the night before, predicting temperatures to drop from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 12 degrees Fahrenheit by midday, with wind gusts reaching 25 miles per hour. That kind of wind played havoc with scent trails, scattering molecules across hundreds of yards and making tracking work a nightmare for search dogs. But it also did something else. It pressed the cold deeper, made the ice sing and crack in ways that sounded like distant thunder. David Carver was 42, lean in the way soldiers stay lean even years after discharge, with short brown hair that had started graying at the temples and a beard he trimmed once a week whether he felt like it or not. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they carried the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. He'd grown up in Linden Falls, left at 18 to join the Army, and returned at 37 with a medical discharge, a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer, and PTSD diagnoses that the VA treated with pills that made him feel like he was watching his life through frosted glass. His wife, Sarah, had left 2 years ago, not because she didn't love him, but because loving him had become a war she couldn't win. Now he lived alone in a rented cabin on the north edge of town, worked part-time at the hardware store, and walked Axel twice a day, once at dawn, once at dusk, because the routine kept the chaos at bay. Axel had come from a shelter in Duluth 3 years ago, a surrender case from a family who couldn't handle his energy. The dog had been thin, anxious, pacing his kennel with the kind of restlessness David recognized in the mirror. The shelter volunteer had warned him that German shepherds were working dogs, that they needed jobs and structure. But David had knelt beside the kennel, and Axel had pressed his muzzle through the chain link, and something unspoken had passed between them. Within a year, David had trained Axel in basic obedience, then advanced tracking, then scent discrimination, using old manuals he'd found online and instincts he didn't know he still possessed. The dog learned German commands because David had served alongside a K-9 unit in Afghanistan and remembered how clean the language sounded in the field. Such for seek, bleed for stay, AUS for release. Axel wasn't certified, wasn't official, but he was sharp and loyal, and David trusted him more than he trusted most people. This morning, February 19th, 2025, at 6:14 a.m., David stood on the gravel access road that led to the eastern shore of Whitefish Pond, and Axel refused to move forward. The dog planted his paws in the snow, tail rigid, ears swiveling like radar dishes, and a low rumble built in his chest. David frowned, scanning the tree line. "What is it, buddy?" His voice was rough and used to speaking aloud this early. Axel barked once, sharp and urgent, then lunged toward the pond's edge, dragging David forward. The leash snapped taut, and David's boots skidded on ice-slick gravel before he caught his balance. "Axel, bleib!" The dog ignored him, which Axel never did. His claws scraped against the frozen shore as he pulled harder, whining now, a sound David had only heard twice before. Once when a shed had caught fire down the block, once when a child had wandered too close to the highway. David's heart kicked into overdrive, adrenaline flooding his system the way it used to before patrols. He let the leash slacken and followed Axel onto the pond's edge, boots crunching through the thin crust of snow that had fallen overnight. The ice beneath was gray-white, textured like frosted glass, and in the dim pre-dawn light, it looked solid enough. But Axel wasn't heading for the center. He was angling left, toward the inlet where Blackbird Creek fed into the pond, where the ice was always thinner because of the current. David's breath caught. He dropped to one knee and squinted across the surface. 50 yards out, near a cluster of dead cattails poking through the ice, he saw it, a dark, irregular patch, a shadow that didn't belong. And then the shadow moved. David's vision tunneled. His hands went numb despite his gloves. For a second, he was back in Kandahar, staring at an overturned Humvee, smoke pouring from the chassis, someone screaming for a medic. Then Axel barked again, and the sound yanked him back. He stood, legs shaking, and pulled his phone from his pocket with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. He dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered, a woman named Linda who'd graduated 2 years behind him in high school. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "This is David Carver. I'm at the east access of Whitefish Pond. There's someone in the water. Under the ice. Send everyone." Linda's voice sharpened. "Under the ice? David, are you sure?" "I'm sure. My dog found them. They're moving. Hurry." He didn't wait for her reply. He shoved the phone back in his pocket and ran, boots pounding across the ice, Axel surging ahead like a missile locked on target. The cold air ripped at his lungs, but he didn't slow. 30 yards. 20. Axel reached the dark patch first and started digging, claws scraping furiously at the ice, sending up sprays of white powder. David dropped beside him and looked down. Beneath 6 inches of gray ice, a face stared up at him. A girl, maybe 16, 17, her eyes wide and terrified, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her hair floated around her head like seaweed, and one hand was pressed flat against the underside of the ice, fingers splayed, nails scraping uselessly. She was wearing a blue parka and jeans, and her skin had gone the color of old wax. David's brain screamed at him that this wasn't real, that this was another flashback, another nightmare his mind had conjured to punish him. But Axel was still digging, still whining, and the girl's eyes tracked David's face with a clarity that no hallucination had ever managed. He slammed his fist against the ice. It didn't crack. He hit it again, harder, and pain shot up his wrist, but the surface only spiderwebbed. The girl's mouth moved, forming words he couldn't hear, and bubbles streamed from her lips. David looked around wildly. No rocks, no tools, nothing but snow and cattails and Axel's desperate clawing. Then he remembered the tire iron. He'd thrown it in his coat pocket 2 days ago after fixing a loose bolt on his truck's hitch and forgotten to put it back. He yanked it out, a 2-foot length of steel, cold and heavy, and raised it above his head. Axel, house. The dog backed away. David brought the tire iron down with every ounce of strength he had. The ice shattered. Water exploded upward, black and freezing, soaking David's coat and jeans in an instant. The cold hit like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, and for a second he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then the girl's hand shot through the hole, fingers clawing at the broken edge, and David grabbed her wrist. Her skin was ice. He pulled, but she was caught on something below, her parka maybe, or her boots tangled in submerged branches. She thrashed, gasping, her face breaking the surface for a heartbeat before slipping back under. David braced his boots against the ice and pulled harder, his shoulders screaming in protest. Axel barked, circling, and then the dog lunged forward and grabbed the girl's collar in his jaws, pulling alongside David. Together, they dragged her up. She came free all at once, a dead weight of soaked clothing and shivering limbs, and David fell backward onto the ice, the girl collapsing on top of him. She was gasping, choking, her whole body convulsing. David rolled her onto her side, and water poured from her mouth, dark and foul-smelling. "Stay with me," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're out. You're safe. Stay with me." Her eyes rolled back, and her shaking intensified, teeth chattering so hard he could hear them clack together. Hypothermia. He'd seen it in the mountains outside Kandahar, soldiers who'd gotten soaked during river crossings and gone into shock within minutes. He knew the protocol: get them warm, get them dry, get them to medical. But out here, on the ice, with the wind picking up and the nearest hospital 32 miles away, protocol felt like a sick joke. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her, then pulled off his flannel shirt and added that too, leaving himself in just a t-shirt that the wind cut through like razors. Axel pressed close, his body heat a small mercy. In the distance, sirens wailed. Deputy Chief Rachel Moss hit the scene at 6:23 a.m., 9 minutes after David's call, which was fast, but not fast enough. She brought 2 firefighters, an EMT named Troy, who looked about 19, and enough equipment to outfit a small army. Rachel was 51, compact and iron gray, a former Army nurse who'd done 2 tours in Iraq before coming home to run the fire department her father had built. She took one look at David, shirtless, shaking, cradling the girl against his chest, and barked orders like she was still in Ramadi. "Troy, thermal blankets now. Jensen, get the sled. Miller, called the Luth general and tell them we're coming in hot with a severe hypothermia case. Teenage female, cold water immersion, estimated time in water unknown." She dropped beside David and the girl, her gloved hands moving over the teenager's body with practiced efficiency. "Pulse is weak, respiration shallow, core temps probably dropped below 90, she muttered. She looked up at David, her eyes sharp. "You pulled her out?" "My dog found her," David said, his voice shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Axel wouldn't stop barking. Rachel glanced at the German shepherd, who sat alert beside David, his amber eyes fixed on the girl. "Good dog," she said, and meant it. Troy arrived with the thermal blankets, silver mylar sheets that crackled as Rachel wrapped them around the girl layer by layer. "We need to get her horizontal, minimize exertion, avoid cardiac arrest from cold blood hitting the heart," Rachel said, her voice clinical. "David, you need warming too. You're showing signs of exposure." He shook his head. "I'm fine." "You're not." "Troy, get him a blanket." They loaded the girl onto the rescue sled, a bright orange plastic shell with runners, and 2 firefighters hauled it toward the shore where the ambulance waited, lights flashing. Rachel walked beside David, her hand on his elbow to steady him as his legs wobbled. "You did good, Carver," she said quietly. "Real good." He didn't answer. His mind was already spiraling, replaying the girl's face under the ice, the way her fingers had clawed at the surface, the seconds that had stretched into hours before he'd broken through. He'd been too slow, too clumsy, too broken to do this right. Someone better would have saved her faster. Rachel seemed to read his thoughts. "David, look at me." He did. "If your dog hadn't found her, she'd be dead. If you hadn't broken that ice, she'd be dead. You saved her life. Do you understand?" He swallowed hard and nodded, but the shame sat heavy in his chest anyway. The girl's name was Emily Tran, 17, a junior at Linden Falls High School, honor roll, varsity cross country, planning to study engineering at the University of Minnesota. She'd been out on the pond at 5:47 a.m. because she'd had a fight with her parents the night before, something stupid about curfew and college applications, and she needed to clear her head. She'd walked onto the ice like she'd done 100 times before, but this time she'd gone too far, stepped on a weak spot near the inlet where the current kept the ice thin, and the world had dropped out from under her. She tried to climb out, but the ice kept breaking, kept giving way, until she'd been pushed under by the current and trapped beneath a solid sheet with nothing but 6 inches of frozen water between her and the sky. She'd screamed until her throat bled, punched until her knuckles split, and then she'd started to go numb, the cold filling her lungs and her thoughts until everything faded to a gray nothing. She'd been under for an estimated 8 to 12 minutes when David and Axel found her. By all medical logic, she should have been dead. But the cold had slowed her metabolism, put her into a state of suspended animation that gave her just enough time. At Duluth General, they brought her core temperature up slowly, 1 degree per hour, using warmed 4 fluids, heated blankets, and a cardiac bypass machine that circulated her blood through an external warmer. She spent 2 days in the ICU, another 3 in the step-down unit, and by the end of the week she was sitting up in bed, eating Jell-O, and asking when she could go home. David didn't visit. He couldn't. Every time he thought about walking into that hospital room, his chest tightened and his hands started shaking and the memories came flooding back. Blood on sand, screams in Arabic, the smell of burning metal. He told himself she didn't need to see him, that she probably didn't even remember his face, that he'd done his part, and now he should disappear back into the woods where he belonged. But the town had other ideas. By the second day, the story had spread through Linden Falls like wildfire. The local paper ran it on the front page. Veteran and his dog saved teen from icy death. The Duluth Tribune picked it up, then the Minneapolis Star, then a couple of regional TV stations. By day 4, David's phone, which he rarely checked, was flooded with messages from reporters, from friends he hadn't spoken to in years, from veterans groups and dog rescue organizations, asking if they could share his story. He deleted them all, but he couldn't delete the people who started showing up at his door. Rachel came first, bringing a casserole and a bottle of whiskey and a long silence that felt more comfortable than any words could have been. Then Emily's parents came, a Vietnamese couple in their 50s who stood on his porch and wept and thanked him in English and Vietnamese until he had to excuse himself and lock the bathroom door because he couldn't breathe. Then came the mayor, a round man named Bill Hendricks who wanted to give David a commendation at the next town council meeting. David said no. Bill said he'd do it anyway. And through it all, Axel stayed close, his warm, solid presence the only thing keeping David tethered to reality. On the 8th day after the rescue, David finally went to the hospital. He didn't plan it. He was driving past on his way to the hardware store, and his hands turned the wheel without asking permission. He parked in the visitor lot, sat in his truck for 20 minutes staring at the building's entrance, and then Axel, who wasn't technically allowed inside, but who David had started bringing everywhere because the dog knew when the panic attacks were coming before David did, nudged his hand and whined. "Yeah, okay," David muttered. They walked in together. Emily was in room 314, and when David knocked on the half-open door, she looked up from her phone and her face lit up. "You're him," she said, her voice still a little hoarse. "You're the guy with the dog." David nodded, suddenly unable to speak. She sat up straighter, wincing a little. "Come in, please." He stepped inside, Axel at his heels, and Emily's eyes went wide. "Is that him? Is that Axel?" "Yeah." She held out her hand, and Axel, sensing her intent, patted forward and pressed his muzzle into her palm. She laughed, a sound that cracked halfway through, and then she was crying, her fingers tangled in Axel's fur. "I remember him," she said, her voice breaking. "I remember his face. I was under the ice, and I thought I was going to die, and then I saw him through the ice, digging, and I thought maybe I was already dead and he was some kind of angel." David's throat closed. "He's just a dog," he managed. "No," Emily said, looking up at him with eyes that were too old for 17. "He's not." They talked for an hour. Emily told him about the fight with her parents, about how stupid she felt for walking onto the ice, about how she'd been so angry and so sure she knew better, and now all she wanted was to go home and hug her mom. David told her about Axel, about how he'd found the dog in a shelter and trained him and trusted him more than anyone. He didn't talk about the war, about the nightmares, about the days when getting out of bed felt like crawling through broken glass. But somehow Emily seemed to understand anyway. "My uncle has PTSD," she said quietly. "He was in Afghanistan. He doesn't talk about it, either." David nodded. "It's hard." "I know," she said, "but you still showed up. You still saved me." He looked at Axel, who was now lying beside Emily's bed, his chin resting on the mattress. "We both did," David said. When David left the hospital that day, something had shifted. The weight on his chest hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter, like he'd been carrying a boulder someone had chipped off a corner. He drove home slowly, Axel in the passenger seat with his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. The town was the same as it had always been, small, quiet, cold. But now people waved at him from their porches, called his name in the grocery store, stopped him on the sidewalk to shake his hand. Some of them were strangers. Some were old classmates he'd avoided for years. All of them said the same thing. "You're a hero." David didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd stumbled into the right place at the right time with a dog who was smarter and braver than he'd ever be. But he also felt, for the first time in a long time, like maybe he wasn't completely broken. Like maybe there was still something worth saving inside him. The town council meeting happened on a Thursday in March, and David tried not to go. But Rachel showed up at his cabin at 6 in the evening, arms crossed, and told him in no uncertain terms that if he didn't get in her truck, she'd arrest him for obstruction. "That's not a real charge," David said. "I'll make it real," Rachel replied. So he went. The meeting was held in the high school gymnasium, which could hold the entire town when it needed to, and tonight it needed to. Every seat was filled, people standing along the walls, kids sitting cross-legged on the floor. Mayor Hendricks stood at a podium on the stage, his voice booming through a microphone that crackled with feedback. "Tonight we honor one of our own," he said, gesturing toward David, who sat in the front row with Axel at his feet and wished he could disappear into the floor. David Carver, a veteran who served our country with distinction, who came home and continued to serve his community in ways big and small. On February 19th, David and his dog Axel saved the life of Emily Tran, a young woman with her whole future ahead of her. Without their quick thinking and bravery, Emily would not be with us today. The gymnasium erupted in applause. David's face burned. Hendricks held up a plaque, gold lettering on dark wood, and read, "Linden Falls Community Hero Award, presented to David Carver and Axel for exceptional courage and selflessness." More applause. David stood because Rachel nudged him hard in the ribs, and he walked onto the stage on legs that felt like they might give out. He shook the mayor's hand, accepted the plaque, and looked out at the crowd. Faces stared back at him, some familiar, some not, all of them smiling, all of them clapping. And then he saw Emily. She was sitting in the third row with her parents, and when their eyes met, she stood up and started clapping louder, and then everyone else stood too, a standing ovation that filled the gymnasium like thunder. David's vision blurred. His hands shook. He looked down at Axel, who sat calmly at his side, tail wagging once, and he thought, "This dog saved me long before I saved anyone else." The mayor handed David the microphone. "Would you like to say a few words?" David shook his head. Then he looked at Emily again, at her parents, at Rachel, at all the faces of people who'd lived alongside him in this town, even when he'd tried to disappear. He cleared his throat. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice rough and too loud through the speakers. "I'm just a guy with a dog who knew something was wrong. Axel's the one who found her. Axel's the one who wouldn't let me walk away. If you want to thank someone, thank him." He looked down at Axel, and the dog looked back, amber eyes steady and calm. The applause started again, softer this time, and someone in the back shouted, "Good boy, Axel." And then everyone was laughing and clapping, and David felt, for the first time in 4 years, like he might actually belong somewhere. After the ceremony, Emily's parents approached him. Her father, Min, was a wiry man with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of years in manual labor. Her mother, Lon, was small and fierce, her eyes red-rimmed but bright. "We can never repay you," Min said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave us our daughter back." David didn't know what to say. "I'm just glad she's okay," he managed. Lon stepped forward and took his hand in both of hers. "You are a gift," she said simply. And then she knelt beside Axel and kissed the top of his head. And Axel, who rarely tolerated strangers touching him, sat perfectly still and let her. In the weeks that followed, life in Linden Falls shifted in small but profound ways. David still walked Axel twice a day, still worked at the hardware store, still woke up at 4:32 a.m. from nightmares he couldn't control. But now, when he walked through town, people stopped to talk to him, to ask how he was doing, to tell him stories about their own dogs or their own struggles. Rachel started inviting him to the fire station for coffee on Sunday mornings, and he started going. Emily came by his cabin once a week to visit Axel, and sometimes she'd stay for dinner, and they'd sit on the porch and talk about nothing and everything. The mayor asked if David would consider training Axel officially for search and rescue work with the county, and David said he'd think about it. A veterans group in Duluth reached out, asking if he'd speak at their next meeting about service dogs and PTSD, and David said no at first, but then Rachel told him he was being a coward, and he said yes. The first time he stood in front of that room full of veterans, his hands shook so hard he could barely hold his notes. On a Saturday in late April, David stood on the shore of Whitefish Pond with Axel at his side. The ice had melted weeks ago, and the water was dark and smooth, reflecting the sky like polished glass. He'd come back here a dozen times since the rescue, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to prove to himself that it had been real, that he'd actually done something good, that the girl was alive because of choices he'd made. He knelt beside Axel and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You know you're a pain in the ass, right?" he said softly. Axel wagged his tail. "But you're my pain in the ass." A car pulled up behind him, gravel crunching under tires, and David turned to see Emily and her parents climbing out. Emily waved, grinning, and Axel barked once in greeting. "We thought we'd find you here," Emily said, walking over. "My parents wanted to bring you something." Min held out a small wooden box, lacquered and carved with intricate patterns. "It belonged to my father," he said. "He brought it with him from Vietnam. I want you to have it." David's throat tightened. "I can't take this." "You can," Lon said firmly. "You gave us everything. Let's give you something back." Inside the box was a compass, brass and old, the needle still sharp. "So you always find your way home," Min said. David closed his eyes and let the tears come. When he opened them, Emily was kneeling beside Axel, her arms around the dog's neck, and Axel was licking her face with the kind of devotion that only dogs understand. "Thank you," David said, his voice breaking. "For what?" Emily asked. "For letting me be part of something good," he said. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that held no shadows, no ghosts, only light. "You always were," she said. That night, back in his cabin, David sat by the fire with Axel stretched out at his feet. The plaque from the town council hung on the wall. The wooden box from Emily's family sat on the mantel. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. He looked down at Axel, whose eyes were half closed in sleep, and he thought about all the ways this dog had saved him. Not just from the darkness, but for something better. "We're going to be okay," David said softly. Axel's tail thumped once against the floor, a quiet affirmation, and outside the window the stars burned cold and bright over Linden Falls, a town that had learned to trust again because a broken man and his dog had refused to walk away when it mattered most.